Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something a little different. Mindfulness in the workplace,
Okay.
but not the typical, meditation room kind of mindfulness. We're going deep into a high-pressure financial institution. Let's call it Banco.
Banco, I like it.
So you've shared some really fascinating research with us.
Yes.
An academic paper. It's titled Peace of Our Mind, Managerial Interventions and the Search for Collective Mindfulness.
Right.
And it really gets into, what happens when you try to bring mindfulness into a world where inner peace isn't exactly a KPI.
It's a fascinating dynamic to unpack for sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
So one thing that jumped out at me, the research highlighted that Banco's initial interest in mindfulness wasn't about like a grand cultural overhaul. It
Right.
wasn't about, transforming into some Zen banking haven.
Right.
What were they after then?
Really, it was much more basic than that. It
Well,
was about addressing the really rampant workplace stress that they were experiencing. So,
like a Band-Aid solution almost.
oh, you could see it that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
They were dealing with burnout, people missing work, all the signs of a very, very high pressure environment.
Yeah, and probably a lot of tension just simmering below the surface too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting how, mindfulness is often framed as this kind of transformative practice.
Right.
But in this case, it seems like it was very much brought in as a way to kind of manage the symptoms of a much larger issue.
Yeah, and this is really important because it sets the stage for how employees are approaching this,
Okay.
how managers are hoping to, benefit from it, even how the trainers are kind of framing their big picture aspirations.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of aspirations, the research talks about three distinct levels of mindfulness at play within Banco.
Right.
We have individual, aggregative, relational, and macro-holistic.
It's a mouthful, I know.
It is. It's a mouthful. And to be honest, some of those sound a bit academic. So
Okay.
can you break them down for us?
Sure, yeah.
Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
So individual aggregative, that's the idea that mindfulness is primarily for personal benefit,
Okay.
right? So I'm using these mindfulness techniques to help me,
Mm-hmm.
but there's kind of this hope that if enough people do it,
Yes.
that some sort of collective effect will emerge.
So, like, if I'm less stressed, maybe it'll rub off on my colleagues.
Exactly, yeah, like a rising tide lifts all boats type of scenario.
Okay, I like that. So it starts with the individual, but there's this aspiration, this hope for a larger impact.
Right.
Okay. What about relational mindfulness?
Mhm.
What's that all about?
So relational mindfulness shifts the focus a bit. It's less about individual peace and more about how mindfulness can change the way people interact with each other.
So better communication, stronger teams, that sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Using mindfulness to build better relationships at work.
It's interesting, right? Because even though we're talking about workplace mindfulness, it's still ultimately about people connecting with each other. Okay, so that's individual, aggregative, and relational. And then we
Yeah.
have this third level, macro holistic. What is that? Because it sounds big.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, stress reduction or even better communication now. This is about mindfulness as a force for transforming the very nature of work itself.
Okay, so not just Banco, but like the whole system.
Exactly, yeah. It's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is.
Yeah.
Oh, so we've got these three levels, and they're all kind of intertwined.
Right.
But before we get ahead of ourselves and start talking about transforming the very nature of work,
Sure.
let's go back to that individual level for a second.
Okay.
The research mentions an employee named Richard who saw mindfulness as, quote, work on myself.
Right.
Like not necessarily a tool for, social change or anything like that.
Mhm.
Did that individualistic view resonate with other employees at Banco?
Yeah, Richard's perspective, it seemed to be a common thread among a lot of the employees. I mean, remember, they're in this high pressure environment
Right.
where individual performance is constantly being evaluated.
Yes.
So it makes sense that their first thought is, how is this going to help me cope?
Right.
How is this going to benefit me personally?
Especially given what we know about Banco's motivation for implementing mindfulness in the first place. It's like, if the organization is approaching it from a very individualistic perspective, like we need to reduce stress,
Yeah.
then it's natural that the employees would kind of follow suit.
And I think it's important to remember that for a lot of these employees, this was their first exposure to mindfulness.
Right.
So they're coming in without a lot of preconceived notions.
Okay, so did the trainers try to kind of steer them towards a more collective understanding of mindfulness?
They did. There was one trainer in particular, Olivier, who seemed to really grapple with this tension
Okay.
between the individual and the collective. But he also seemed to recognize that, coming in with this radical collective agenda
Yeah.
right off the bat in this type of environment was probably going to be met with a lot of resistance.
So how do you bridge that gap, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got these individuals who are like, okay, mindfulness, this is about me, this is about my stress.
Yes.
But then you have these trainers who have these grander visions, right?
Yeah.
Of like transforming the workplace.
Exactly.
So did they just throw in the towel on the collective mindfulness idea?
Not entirely. I think they saw this individual focus as a necessary first step,
Okay.
right? Like get people in the door,
Okay.
get them to buy in, to experience the personal benefits, and then hopefully that creates some sort of ripple effect.
So almost like a grassroots movement rather than a top-down approach.
Exactly. They were hoping that as more people, like Richard, had these positive experiences,
Yeah.
that it would kind of subtly shift the culture over time.
That's interesting because it's almost like saying, be the change you want to see in the world,
Yeah.
but apply to the workplace, right? Like,
Yeah,
instead of trying to actively change others, just focus on your own practice and
Right.
hope that it has this ripple effect.
Yeah, and it's a really appealing idea, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a workplace like Banco, where people are, very independent and probably not super receptive to being told what to do.
Like you're planting these seeds of mindfulness and just kind of, seeing what grows.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes this research so compelling is that it's not just theoretical, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at how these ideas played out in the real world in this very specific context.
And I think that's a great place to pause for now,
Yeah.
because in our next part, we're going to really dig into, how did this actually work in practice?
Right.
Did this idea of individual practice
Right.
leading to collective change, did it actually pan out?
Right. And we'll explore some of the mechanisms they use to try to bridge that gap.
I'm excited to dig into that.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
All right, well, stay tuned, everyone, because we're just getting started.
It's going to be fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
Welcome back. All right, so we're back on the mindfulness train. Last we left off, we were talking about these different levels of mindfulness and how Banco was really hoping that by encouraging individual practice, they eventually see this kind of organic shift towards a more collectively mindful workplace.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned these kind of unusual terms, shining and spreading,
Right.
as potential strategies for bridging that individual to collective gap.
Exactly.
And I got to say, those terms, they sound a little bit more like, wellness buzzwords than like actual corporate strategies.
Yeah, I can see why you might say that.
So indulge me here. What exactly do they mean in this context?
Okay, so shining, this was about a more subtle approach. It wasn't about like actively preaching mindfulness to your colleagues, but more about embodying it yourself. Like
Yeah.
if you're calmer, more focused, more present, the hope was that it would kind of rub off on those around you.
So leading by example, but on
Yeah.
a more like subconscious level.
Exactly. It's like the subtle energy that you bring into the workplace.
Okay, I kind of get it, but it also sounds incredibly difficult to like measure.
It is, and the researchers acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But they also found that these were the terms the participants themselves were using.
Interesting.
So it gives us this really interesting window into, how they were making sense of these ideas.
Did they give any concrete examples of this shining in action?
Yeah, one participant, Caroline, she used this really interesting metaphor. She compared it to radiation.
Radiation.
Yeah, she said that she believed her own mindfulness practice had this ripple effect, even if her colleagues weren't consciously aware of it.
Okay, I mean, I appreciate the image, but radiation doesn't exactly have the most positive connotations.
Right, and that's just one person's interpretation.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that, this approach, while well-intentioned, it has its limitations.
It makes me wonder, what about those who weren't receptive?
Right.
Or those who felt pressured to shine, even if they weren't feeling particularly mindful at work?
It's a really important point, and it gets to the heart of why relying solely on unspoken influence can be tricky.
Right. It's like if the workplace culture itself is still, high stress,
Right.
simply witnessing a colleague's calmness, it's probably not going to magically transform everything.
Exactly.
Okay, so if shining is about this kind of subtle, almost unconscious influence, what about spreading? How is that different?
So spreading was a bit more deliberate.
Right.
It involved things like actually talking about mindfulness with colleagues,
Okay.
sharing resources, encouraging them to participate in training.
So less about vibes, more about actual conversations.
Yeah, and Benko did try to provide some support for this.
Okay, like what?
They offered pamphlets, suggested talking points for people who wanted to, share their
It
experiences.
sounds like they were trying to give employees the tools to have these conversations.
Yeah, but there wasn't a real clear strategy for how to actually foster a culture that embraced these conversations.
It still feels very much like it was on the individual to
Right.
kind of spread the mindfulness gospel, so to speak.
And it also raises the question of leadership's role in all of this.
Yes,
Yeah.
because it seems like, even with the best intentions, if you don't have buy-in from the top,
Absolutely.
it's going to be really difficult to create lasting change.
And the trainers at Benko, they definitely recognize this.
Okay.
They emphasized the need for what they called champions.
Champions.
Yes, influential leaders who could act as hubs for spreading mindfulness throughout the organization.
So these are like the mindfulness evangelists of
Big
Banco.
way, yeah.
And the idea was that if these leaders, truly embraced mindfulness and integrated it into their leadership style, it would trickle down and create a more receptive environment for collective practice.
Exactly.
Okay, so did Banco actually identify these mindfulness champions?
Well, that's the thing.
What?
The research suggests that while this idea of champions, it sounded good on paper,
Yeah.
it never really translated into reality.
So another good idea that got lost in translation.
It seems like it. There was no formal process for identifying or supporting these leaders.
So even with the best intentions, without a clear structure, without that support from the top,
It's an uphill battle, for sure.
it makes you wonder if collective mindfulness is even possible in a place like Banco.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Listeners, you won't want to miss the final part of our deep dive where we tackle this question head on. We'll explore if Banco's experiment offers any valuable lessons for the future of mindfulness in the workplace. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through the ups and downs of workplace mindfulness.
It really has. So we've got to circle back to that million-dollar question.
Right.
Does this research give us a definitive answer?
Okay.
Is collective mindfulness actually achievable in a place like Banco?
It's not a simple yes or no.
Okay.
And that's one of the things I appreciate about this research. It doesn't offer easy answers
Right.
or paint a black and white picture.
Yeah, no silver bullets.
What it does is it gives us this really nuanced look at the complexities.
So we're left with more questions than when we started.
More informed questions, I think.
I like that. Okay, so what are some of those lingering questions, those ripples in the mindfulness pond that you think are worth exploring further?
Well, for me, one of the biggest takeaways is how these unspoken norms
Okay.
really shape how people behave at work.
Those unwritten rules.
Exactly. Remember Luke and his anxiety about closing his eyes in the open office?
Oh, yeah.
That perfectly illustrates how powerful these kind of invisible forces can be.
Yeah, and in a place like Banco, those unwritten rules probably include things like time is money. Don't show weakness.
Always be on. Yeah.
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 So how do you rewrite that script then?
It's a big question.
It is.
And it goes way beyond just mindfulness.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about changing deeply ingrained beliefs about productivity, about competition.
What it means to be successful.
Exactly.
And that's huge.
It is.
So where do you even begin?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that these systems, these structures, they're not set in stone.
Okay.
And it requires a real, genuine commitment from the top down.
Not just lip service.
Not just a meditation app and call it a day.
Right. It's got to be more than just like a wellness program.
Right. It's about creating a culture where vulnerability isn't a liability.
Where slowing down is just as valuable as speeding up.
Yeah. And where connection, genuine human connection, is at the heart of how work gets done.
It's a beautiful vision, but it also feels like a long road ahead.
It is. It's a journey, not a destination, right?
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And listeners, what are your thoughts? Have you experienced this tension between individual and collective well-being in your own workplace? Head over to our website or find us on social media, and let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.